Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to try and time myself because I don't think I've completely worked out whether this is going to fit 20 minutes. I don't really want to go over because I found that this is the third time I've done this seminar, and it's actually always very interesting to listen to the questions. So I will definitely try and keep within my time. So I'm, as I say, very pleased to come and speak to you again this year, as this is the third time. For me, it's also great to catch up on the latest developments going on in Ireland in more depth, rather than just sometimes skimming through cases or reviews. It's also a good moment, actually, for me to sit down and look through, actually, what has happened over the year before I present it to you and to assess what the real enforcement challenges are. I think, as I explained previously, I'm a British-trained barrister who moved from working in the Commission first on waste legislation, more in a sort of drafting role, to enforcement, and there mainly I worked on UK enforcement cases. For obvious reasons, I've moved towards not only working on UK environmental issues, but now for the last 4 years, I think it is, I've been working almost 4 years on Irish issues, which for me has actually been really fascinating. I think particularly interesting coming as a UK lawyer to this than maybe if I'd been a continental lawyer, because there are many similarities in the legal structures of how the two countries approach the implementation of environmental law into their national law from the EU. I mean, both countries obviously have a common law base, but also sometimes their legal implementation structures follow similar patterns. So one example is planning law, as was mentioned, and I'm really pleased, Judge Baker, that you also find Irish planning law difficult to fathom, because I have to say I struggled, particularly when drafting a reasoned opinion on environmental impact assessment and its application to peat bog extraction. But similarly to the UK, it's split into different systems where the environmental impact assessment focuses mainly on the planning decision-making stage, and then there's a parallel environmental permitting process. And slightly infuriatingly for somebody who's looking at it from the outside, trying to assess whether overall compliance is achieved with the legislation, it's also put into different sectoral pieces of legislation, which are painstaking to amend and also difficult for us to assess at the EU level. I think Ireland also shares some of the frustrations that colleagues in the UK share with having most environmental cases heard through judicial review. This is often seen as a rather blunt, slow and expensive way of implementing environmental law, even if it has to be said that the process in both countries has been adapted and improved over time. And in Ireland in particular, I think as was already mentioned, the process actually delivered some really big and important judgments in Ireland recently, even if maybe sometimes it's not ideal for hearing often technical and scientific disagreements. Anya, as you know, or maybe you don't know, I also attended the workshop, I think it was last week, on access to justice, and listened with great envy, actually, to the situation in New South Wales presented by Mr. Justice Preston, and the fact that they do have scientific advisors and a lot of support, technical support from the courts to assist in working through environmental judgments. So it's not really surprising that both countries that I've worked on, in both the UK and Ireland, there have been dreams of setting up specialised environmental courts. I would say that there are similarities and there are also differences between the two in the approach that's taken. Some of the differences, I'd say, in Ireland are good. I'd say particularly Ireland is much less industrialised and urbanised and has the space available to give to nature. Ireland also has some very proactive and professionally staffed agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency in particular, which is not afraid to speak truth to power. I know many in Northern Ireland can look on in envy. But there are also areas where I must confess the comparison is maybe less positive. The one that really jumps to mind and surprised me is the lack of systematic embracing processes of public participation, particularly in the drafting of new legislation. The fact that that there is often legislation presented in a hurry. Maybe that doesn't surprise me. Having worked in the Commission also on drafting legislation, there's an impatience to get the process through. But there is a concern that there is a lack of transparency, I would say. Also sitting in Brussels trying to work out what new legislation is coming, the lack of transparency time given to public participation, which I think is, from an outside view, is a bit frustrating. So this year, I think instead of cantering through the open environmental infringement cases, which I looked over the last two presentations that I did, which would be rather repetitive, given that, as you mentioned, the audience is often the same audience that maybe came before. I thought it would be helpful to give you insight more into how the Commission approaches environmental enforcement using some Irish examples. Particularly moving from what used to be seen as an approach of looking at individual cases, complaint-driven cases, now to a more what we would call systemic breach enforcement process. I think, I don't know how many people have followed this so far back, certainly before I joined the European Commission, environmental enforcement actions were started then by the head of you, Dr. Kramer, who prided himself by saying that anyone could write to the Commission and raise a concern and that would be looked at. Our doors were basically always open to citizens. One of the cases that was often quoted, and one I actually inherited when I first joined the unit, was the Blackpool bathing waters case, which resulted in one of the first environmental judgments against the UK for its breach of the 1976 Bathing Waters Directive. The case, also legend has it, was sent initially on the back of a postcard from somebody saying the bathing waters were too dirty for locals to swim in. Over the years, though, environmental enforcement has moved significantly away from reliance on individual complaints and much more towards what we call strategic cases, trying to address systemic breaches. Understandably, this has not been particularly popular with individual complainants who hope often when they write to us that their complaints will be taken up and go straight to the European Court. But that actually has always often been unrealistic, given that the European Court is more of a constitutional court than a local court. So also it has to be said that there was a point at which assessing individual cases and complaints was beginning to swamp staff within what still remains now quite a small team in the enforcement units. So that said, we still have a system. I think it's, I would say personally, slightly badly explained to complainants how we go about assessing complaints, but there still is an important role to play for individuals who complain to the Commission. Because if we look at complaints or we look at concerns that we have, getting complaints for individuals really gives you a real life look at what is happening on the ground. And those insights are sometimes far more informative than just looking at, say, a consultant's report or member state monitoring data. You may also get a complaint that initially looks like a one-off, but then you suddenly get 1, 2, 3, 4 people raising the same issues. And then you realise that maybe there's an underlying problem or a wider problem that you need to look at. Also, if we take cases to court, judges don't want to look at cases that are simply theoretical. Individual complaints really do then explain why a particular issue is a problem and what the implications can be in real life. So we do still look at individual complaints, but I think in a way that probably frustrates many complainants in the sense that they do not, as a result, get a judgment that they feel deals with their individual problems. So basically that approach was sort of set out more concrete in 2017 in the communication of the Commission called EU Law, Better Results Through Better Application. And we shifted already before 2017, in fact, to trying to build larger cases using data, in particular using data reported to the Commission by member states directly. The theory being obviously that if they reported it, they couldn't really dispute it in front of the court. So if we look at a couple of sectors where we started using this approach, one of the biggest sectors and probably the biggest, I would say probably the biggest client of cases that we have in front of the court at the moment is the urban wastewater sector. The 1991 Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive has resulted in a really quite substantial caseload. What we do is the member states report on their compliance every 2 years. These reports form the basis of a rather painstaking litigation where we look at breaches, agglomeration by agglomeration, article by article. The cases are probably not particularly sexy in terms of legal innovation, but they do provide a gradual ratchet of pressure on member states to invest and upgrade. In Ireland, we have a judgment from March 2019, that's in case C42717, where improvements are being implemented, but final compliance is still some way off, which is of concern. Interesting though, coming back to the complaints-driven approach from before, we have actually very few complaints about failures to meet the requirements of this directive, even though it's one of our biggest caseloads, not just from Irish citizens, but also across the EU. And when we do get complaints, it tends to be of a more local nature, often about individual sewer overflows that are maybe malfunctioning or simply discharging too often or without control. Another sector where we struggled a bit, I would have to say, in building systemic breach cases is the air quality sector. Initially, what we tried to do is build on case law that we had, case structures that we had for the bathing waters cases, where we don't have as much case law as we did in the past, which was also looking at reports of breach. And then taking agglomeration and zone by zone and looking at the historic years of breach, whether there was a nitrogen dioxide level breach or a PM10 fine dust particulate breach. And then basically taking that case to court and saying, well, year on year on year, there's been these breaches, so therefore agglomeration X must be in breach, and we can then enforce in future if action is not taken. The court really didn't like this approach. It basically gave us, I wouldn't say empty judgments, but judgments that accepted the breaches, but did not accept the claim of the Commission that this was evidence that in future there was also likely to be a breach that we could follow up. So we had to go back to square one, and the new judgments that we'll see coming through have required the Commission not only to prove individual year-on-year breaches, but also to look at in each individual case at the air quality improvement plan and identify why that plan is not sufficiently ambitious in terms of bringing to an end the breaches in the shortest time span possible. That obviously is a different case to the one we were looking to bring before, but they have also been quite successful, and the court accepts that as our systemic case for that directive, the air quality directive. Particularly interesting in this sector is that unlike the wastewater treatment sector, there have been significant parallel national litigation actions ongoing at the same time to try and push enforcement through the national courts. In the UK, for example, there was client earth cases. In Germany, there was the Deutsche Umwelthilfe. And that's also, for us, resulted in some really interesting reference cases to the court and some interesting jurisprudence. For me personally, a particularly interesting one was the Deutsche Umwelthilfe case, which went to court, and I went with the Commission team, because basically the local, the NGO was trying to enforce the directive in Bavaria, in Munich, and claimed that by way of sanction, it was necessary for the German system to basically lock up the Bundesminister President of Bavaria. That was a pretty challenging case, also for the Commission in terms of a political position. But I think it was what it did in many ways for us is focus the debate also not just on our own enforcement actions, but on looking at how member states themselves use and frame sanctions. And I'll come to that maybe at the end when we look at compliance promotion. In the nature sector, we have been looking at legal designations as a priority, legal designations of nature protection sites as a first priority. So that was a key element also of the Irish birds case, a very old judgment from case 41804 from 2007. And it's also a key plank of the case that's now before the court, on the Habitats Directive. That case was, the application went into court now in July. I think we're still waiting for the Irish defence. It may have just come in. That looks at basically the legal designation of habitat sites, and then the setting of conservation objectives per site, and then the need to set restoration or protection targets, for example, that need to be delivered with tangible measures. So all three elements need to be in place to ensure compliance. For the Irish case, we also additionally tried to focus on specific habitats and species to make this also very specific to those habitats and species that are important in Ireland. So we were looking at blanket bogs, coastal lagoons, and freshwater pearl mussel. And in terms of other strategic cases that we have, and also obviously this case is not one we just have against Ireland. We have a case in the court against Germany, other member states as well, where we looked across the board at the same issues. We also have cases, a case against Ireland, which is only an EU pilot, but is one that I think in future will become increasingly important, which looks at the failure to designate offshore sites under the Habitats Directive. This will become, I think, a file which is increasingly important to watch given Ireland's ambitions for offshore renewables. There is a real urgency in ensuring that development is only allowed in areas that have been fully assessed. And at present, I think less than 3% of Ireland's seas are designated as SOCs. So that is something we will have to look at quite closely, I think, in the coming year or so. And I think the final section of I would like to look at in terms of our systemic cases, systemic breach cases, is the area of governance and compliance promotion. I think many people find that their attention reduces when we start to talk about governance and compliance promotion. I think people can visualize cases on tracking individual landfills or even building wastewater treatment plants, or understanding why diesel vehicles may emit pollution that cause health concerns. But governance and compliance promotion are probably not as cuddly or as easy to visualize, but they are really key in terms of us delivering on our environmental requirements. I think governance obviously includes giving people access to environmental information, not only when they specifically ask for it, but already thinking early on how information held by authorities can be made actively available. And if this is done well, it can also alleviate the burden of civil servants of having to answer each request individually. It's something I personally have experience of. We obviously also get access to documents requests. But open decision making also ensures that nothing is hidden, and that the decisions in the end may not become miraculously more popular, but they are better understood and in many ways more able, if they're well argued, to withstand appeals. I think that's something that is often forgotten. Over the years, I think we've also received regular complaints from citizens in Ireland that access to information is not given, that it's too slow, or in particular when information is needed within a short time frame to understand or potentially appeal a decision, either for lodging a JR case or for being able to participate in the consultation process in an informed manner. That slowness is causing problems in terms of allowing for full participation rights for the public. I think we also recently received complaints about this in the context of the Derry O'Brien wind farm, where we obviously still have an open case. That's something we're looking at. In terms of access to information, that obviously goes hand in hand with the right of public participation in decision making. In the last, I'd say, 2 or 3 years, we've received a number of complaints regarding forestry applications and also agriculture appeals, where public participation has come at a price. Claimants have also sent us concerns about the fact that forestry applications are being made in large numbers, so that there are not particularly reasonable timeframes to assess all the information in one go. In terms of environmental access to justice, this is a subject matter that is always been of concern since I can remember dealing with Ireland and even before. And it's something that's regularly brought to our attention by Irish complainants. I think over the years there have been improvements, certainly with the cost rules in environmental cases, reducing cost exposure risks, which have been welcome. But I would say announcements for amendments where we were told first looking at consolidating our Aarhus bill, the legislation that was existing in a more coherent fashion, but then more recently seeing heads of bill for a housing bill that looked as if it was aimed to restrict access to justice in parts of the environmental acquis, in a sense sending Ireland in a different direction of travel. That's been rather difficult to follow. So from the Commission's point of view, we would really prefer that there was a more strategic focus, and also that individual complainants were referable back to a national review process that was robust and affordable, rather than for people, obviously, to come to the Commission with individual complaints. Obviously, the significant expense for individuals, even for their own expense in legal bills, as Judge Baker mentioned, is something that we have been looking at for some time. On that point, actually, I recall we had litigation against the United Kingdom, which has a similar expensive system, particularly in terms of legal costs. And one of the key elements of Commission versus UK and points of dispute is whether the Commission had actually argued that own legal costs for lawyers was a legitimate issue that could be taken into account by the court. But Commission versus UK, Court of Justice came down very firmly to say, yes, own costs must be taken into account if the system is set up in such a way that a litigant really can only go forward if they themselves are represented legally. In terms of strategic work in this sector, the Commission has tried to support access to environmental justice through the publication of its Access to Justice Notice, but also through its interventions before the Court of Justice when cases are referred. So it has to be said, though, on access to justice, much of the case law report is made through reference cases. So for Ireland, notably, as has already mentioned, the Clone case, but also North East Highlands. Those have been particularly, I think, also informative for the Irish system. But the Commission has also started to look more closely at compliance promotion and what this could mean in practice at the EU and member state level. There was a Commission paper issued in 2018 on actions to improve environmental compliance in government. And we've started a dialogue on this with all member states, including Ireland now, looking in detail at how compliance is assured in the framework of the Water Framework Directive. As you may be aware, Ireland has just issued its third draft of the Basin Management Plan, aimed to set out the plan for 2022 to 27 for consultation. And this shows areas of concern, in particular with the overall conclusion that progress, or some good progress in the past, is being undermined due to evidence of mounting environmental pressures from nutrient pollution, particularly from agriculture. So the aim of this new EU pilot is that we look not only at the legal controls, but we have transposed Article 11.3 and the powers, but we look at the practical application, and that we look at the scheme that's been set up for inspections and sanctions. We look at how public participation is ensured within the regime, and we look also at some of the interesting case law that's come out recently on the Water Framework Directive, particularly on public participation in the North Rhine-Westphalia case, in C535/18, to see that public participation is seen as a key requirement by member states when they're looking at compliance assurance. And I think this is a new approach that we're taking. It is a very complex and complete questionnaire, I would say, that we've sent each member state. And it will be interesting to see what results we get and how they compare across the different member states, and particularly on how they use sanctions internally to try and push basically the requirements of the directive to be recognised. whether that's abstraction controls, looking at direct emissions to water, but also diffuse pollution. So for each of those sectors, obviously, we're looking at very different stakeholders. That's a new approach we're taking. Let's see what that brings. So if you see from my presentation over the last 2 years, looking at actually individual cases that we have open on infringement per member state, you can see that Ireland is very much where it was before. I think we actually have 15 cases now, just from April 2021. We have 15 infringement cases open against Ireland. April 2021, in fact, the UK cases, I think by the end of the year, should be down to 3. So that will change this map significantly, and it will work from a number of member state either, so that shouldn't be on there. But we have 14 open infringement files at the moment against Ireland. I think I will leave it there.